I ended up in the philosophy section, so I would like to thank Yves, first of all, for bringing me here. It's my first physical meeting since 2 years, I guess, for all of you. It's quite challenging, and thank you, Marcello, and your staff to make this possible. It's a great experience. So I'm an experimentalist, but I ended up in the philosophy section, so there will be many words and few data and a lot of speculations. So I hope you forgive me for that. The problem became very clear during these days, or this day and a half. On the one hand, we understand ourselves as the product of a continuous evolutionary process, no doubt about this. And at the same time, we perceive ourselves as existing both in a material dimension, this is our bodily existence, and also participating in the spiritual immaterial dimension. There seems to be no doubt about this either. And this dichotomy is, of course, the origin of severe philosophical problems. It's the mind-body problem, or the mind or the soul-body problem. And it's also the hard problem of consciousness. How should we go about with our feelings, the contents of our consciousness, the qualia? This is something that interests the neurobiologists who look for the neural correlates of consciousness. So we are confronted with this problem from a different perspective. Now, there are personal dimensions related to this immaterial dimension. This is, as I just mentioned, consciousness and its contents, the qualia. They are intangible, but we experience them as real. And then there are, of course, also the attributions, self-attributions, that we are an autonomous, intentional self. There seems to be something immaterial that lives in us and decides for us. And this concept is also very much related to the problem of free will, since the brain programs what we do, and on the other hand, we have the impression that we are free to do whatever we want in the next possible moment. But there are also extrapersonal dimensions, and these are the contents of all the belief systems, transcendental forces, metaphysical entities, spiritual entities. All this is populating our world, and we think that this is all real, and it makes us erect cathedrals, so it is very effective in controlling our behavior. So the question is, how are they connected to each other? Do they exist in parallel, these two dimensions, the material and the immaterial? Do they exist in parallel, or did one emerge from the other? This is, of course, in the heart of the philosophical problems of ontological or substance dualism versus monism. If they exist in parallel, at which stage of biological evolution did they connect? Only humans, we just talked about this problem. If the immaterial emerged from the material, what is the plausible evolutionary scenario to explain this? So let me briefly sketch the agenda for what I'm trying to do. This is to develop an evolutionary scenario of this phase transition from the material to the spiritual. So I think it requires a biological evolution that leads towards agents which have very special cognitive and executive functions. And we have talked a lot about those while we were here. We need a mechanism that allows us the creation of immaterial realities, probably by social interactions among these agents, because there's nothing else we have to build on. And then I think very important is that there needs to be a mechanism that allows us to use these immaterial realities, once we have created them, as priors for the perception of ourselves and the others. And I will come back to this. Perception is a very constructivistic process, and we perceive what our priors allow us to perceive. So we need a mechanism that allows us to internalize these immaterial dimensions as priors for perceptions of ourselves and the others. And I give you examples of how that could work. And then we need lately integrate the immaterial dimension into the self-model, and this is done through education and cultural evolution, because we are convinced that we belong to this dimension. And so we have to find a way of how we get to those convictions. How are convictions taking place? So, well, I will go through to this step by step. The requirements. We need the ability to abstract in order to generate symbolic representations. And we have heard about this several times. We seem to have that. We need the ability to communicate and understand symbols. There was also evidence presented that this is the case. And we need the ability to develop self-awareness. These are things that are still biological evolution. We find these prerequisites certainly also in certain animals. So how did it come about? We heard this morning how the complexity of the brain has increased during evolution, and that this is the basis for the emergence of new cognitive and executive functions. And here is just a brief summary of what has been said already this morning. In lower animals, I think I can put on a cursor here. Can you see my cursor? Yeah. Mm-hmm. In lower animals, we have a fairly short pathway from sensory areas into executive motor areas and out into the world again. So there's a fairly closed loop. And these processing streams are quite separate for different modalities. It's very difficult for animals, if they learn something through the auditory sense, to recognize the same object if they see it, or if they touch it and they have to re-identify that they see it. We have no problem for reasons I will come to immediately. What we see during evolution is that there's an enormous increase of processing substrate, mainly the cerebral cortex and the cerebellum. So new cortical areas are added that treats the output of the already existing areas as if this input came from the outer world. So this is sort of a meta processing of a process that has already occurred. We have more and more of these areas, and they act as associative areas, and they assure connections between different sensory modality streams. On the one thing, which allows for abstraction, because if you are able to recognize the same in the seemingly different, like you see an object which looks as it looks, and then you grasp it, then you would discover that it's the same, then there is already a process of abstraction achieved. And then we have these very interesting recurrent connections among all those areas. They're all reciprocally coupled between and within the processing hierarchies. So this allows for re-entry, for, if you like, metacognition, and this is also probably the basis for self-awareness, that you can run a protocol of your brain processes by looking onto your own brain to some extent. And we know that many of these functions are present in animals. Stanislas has mentioned that even self-awareness is there. The emergence of new functions because of increasing connectivity, complexity, intermodal comparison allows for abstraction. The modular architecture and the connections between these modules, they allow to establish nested relations, which is the basis for syntax and symbolic language. And then this recursive processing is probably the basis of metacognition and phenomenal awareness. We know that animals have phenomenal awareness, they have sort of a metacognition, they can cheat, and they have even the primitive version of the theory of mind, draws can cheat, which means they can imagine what the respective other thinks just in that moment, more or less. But they show something of that behavior. So it seems that biological evolution based on neuronal networks, brains that are based on neuronal networks, produce cognitive agents with all these nice abilities. But not all abilities can be evolved by biological evolution alone. Some of them need some social interactions. One of them is the ability to develop a theory of mind. You need, of course, two agents in order to get there, that get into a dialogue, telling each other that they know what you know, that they know, that I know that how you feel, and so on. So still a doubt whether this does exist in animals. Stani will comment on this afterwards. There are some traces of it, but certainly it is present in humans. Now the question is, can we also account for the emergence of an immaterial, a mental or a spiritual dimension that we perceive as concrete and existing, and that is so convincing to us that we can integrate it in our self-model, in the model of the world, and also in our self-model. So somehow we need to have the ability to construct and perceive immaterial realities. Now, how could that be? Could that be done? It would, of course, require interaction of more than just two, because there has to be shared experience. One has to convince oneself that something that one has constructed is really there. So we want to create social realities, as Searle had called it. So how could we do that? I already said there should be several agents so that they can share an experience and reassure each other that what they perceive is real, is worth dealing with. It's not just an illusion. So here's the Gedanken experiment. Imagine a population of primitive hominids, I don't know how to address them properly, in front of a cage, eating, sharing food, and communicating. And they will sooner or later discover that there are certain individuals who are extremely greedy, grabbing the meat, always trying to get more than the others, while others are generous and they share. So there's something they will collectively experience, that there's something in the human that has no name yet, but is sensed as greediness, or sensed as generosity, or sensed as fairness. So what to do with these emergent realities, experiences that are immaterial, that you can't touch? You start to name them, you give them a name. And from that moment on, there is something you can deal with. You can talk about it, and it becomes more and more of a reality. So this creation of the immaterial realities is a social consensus act. With a shared experience of immaterial phenomena, that they are named, and then these phenomena are re-represented in concrete objects through symbols and rituals, so they are retransferred into the material world that you can touch, and they stand for something that has a name and that is concrete, that can be experienced, and there is mutual assurance of the existence of these things through rituals, for example. So why do these things become so compelling convictions? Why are they becoming so concrete? And this, I think, is due to the way in which our perceptual instruments are organized. I already mentioned that perception is a constructivistic process, and that how we perceive the world is determined by and large by the innate and acquired priors, which is the architecture of our nervous system. Partly is genetically determined, part of it is acquired through experience, and we are very much at ease in perceiving a three-dimensional world, but we have great difficulties in imagining a multidimensional world because we have no priors for it. The same is true for linear and nonlinear dynamics. So, since we are not aware of the existence of these priors, they are implicit. We don't know that we have this machinery because our brain is transparent to us. We take for real what we perceive, and then the experience becomes conviction. And I will show you in a moment with a little experiment how compelling what for our perception is what we perceive, since we don't know how it came about. There are plenty of visual illusions that demonstrate this, but I have brought one. You look at this squared checkerboard, and I tell you now that A and B are exactly of the same brightness. It doesn't look as if, but it is the case, and I can show you in taking away a little bit of the context. See, oops. So, the same amount of photons coming back from A and B, but still you see them very differently. And you wouldn't argue with anybody that B is brighter than A. Why is that so? There is this green cone that throws a shadow over the checkerboard. And now, since the brain gets the same amount, the eye, of photons from A and from B, but it also sees as a contextual embedding the shadow. The brain calculates if there is a shadow and there are still coming as many photons back from B as from A, then B needs to be brighter. So the brain makes a very complex inference given the context and then presents you what the outcome of this calculation is. And what you see is not what there is there, but you see what the brain offers you after a complex calculus. And this is the same for all perceptions. Even the perception of this room here is the consequence of an inferential process that is based on priors. So, the first conclusion is that I would propose that due to social interactions and cultural evolution, humans extended the material dimension of their embedding environment by an immaterial dimension, which they populated with a host of social realities, concepts, beliefs, and immaterial agents, ghosts, etc. These immaterial entities are perceived as real and henceforth shape as priors our perceptions and behavior as efficiently as the material constituents of the world. If they become priors, we don't know about their existence, as we don't know about the other existence of these priors that produce this illusion. What we have perceived is taken as existing. So what we still need is the ability to use features of these immaterial realities as priors for perception, and then the ability to integrate these perceptions of immaterial realities in our self-model, to just generalize it to us. So it's also applying to us. So proposal is that self-perception is also depending on priors, just as the perception of the outer world. Why should it be different? We need the conviction that immaterial realities exist, and then they assume the role of a prior in self-perception. So experience of one's own and the respective others' immaterial dimensions or properties, so the consciousness, the intentions, the feelings, the self of the other and of myself, mediate sort of a self-attribution of an immaterial dimension to ourselves. And education reinforces this, and so it becomes part of our subjective reality. Now, why there is no cognitive conflict with the integration of a spiritual dimension in our self-model? A dimension that we really can't grasp, that we can't see, that we have constructed. I think this is because we are not aware of the priors that determine our perception. And because we have no awareness of the material processes underlying the functions of our brains, the brain is transparent to us. We can't imagine what's happening in our brain. We don't feel it. It does stuff for us that eventually we perceive, and we say we perceive. But it's a transparency problem. So to wrap up, I would like to propose that there were network interactions, in this case, neurons in the brain, through evolution becoming more and more complex, generating agents that were endowed with certain cognitive functions that we had talked a lot about the last 2 days. Now, these agents, again, assembled into very complex social networks, many interactions, mutual interactions, attributions, and they, through the process I just described, they create these immaterial realities that are part of the spiritual dimension that exists all of a sudden. That, of course, acts back through epigenetic modifications, through education on the ontogeny of these cognitive agents, which again acts back on the network. So there's an iterative process of coevolution of these realities. So in conclusion, I think that it is possible, without stretching too much what we know, to give a naturalistic account of the emergence of a spiritual dimension. Now, if this were true, it could help to settle a lot of epistemic disputes on consciousness, this strange immaterial dimension of our consciousness. It would also have consequences on the discussion on free will, because we would discover that this is an attribution, a cultural attribution, that is taken from this experience of having this transcendental or immaterial dimension, it has consequences for discussions on mental causation and, of course, for the mind-body problem. But if it were true, I don't know how it can be proven. It would, I think, contribute to the foundation of a secular ethics, so that we don't have to ask for transcendental forces to tell us what is good and bad, but we would have to do it ourselves, as we did all the rest during evolution. And with this, I thank you for your patience. Thank you.